Alright, hey everyone. This is the live paneling analysis for Chapter 1106, since I'm still dealing with all of that copyright nonsense. So we're going to go through from start to finish, talk with chat about what I think is good about the paneling in this chapter, and, talk about anything else to do with the chapter, any other One Piece questions you have for me. And for those watching live, I might do some gaming after. Honestly, depends on how many viewers we get, because if this stays a low-viewed thing, then I'll probably just put the VOD up on YouTube. But anyway, let's get started. I don't really have a lot to say about the color page, just because, or not the color page, the cover page, just because, it looks good, but, there's usually not much paneling going on in those, and it's only really doing a lot with visual storytelling when there's, a cover story. Now, you're probably noticing that the screen is very blue right now. That's just, to ward off, copyright stuff, both on Twitch and YouTube. Probably, as I figure things out in the future, it might not always be as harsh as this, but this is just something I had my thumbnail guy throw together. Now, let's get started. So, you know what? I gotta turn... do I turn the volume down a bit? Hang on. It's a little too loud. It's distracting me. Alright, whatever, that'll have to do. So, the way... Sorry, this is gonna be jank. But what I definitely like about the opening scene here is just how much the framing shows the sheer size of the pirate ship that the Giants are taking compared to the island. Like, it sets up a great tension. We're starting the chapter with something that's sort of going to be paid off on at the end. And what we're getting here is this foreshadowing for the future that what's happening here is huge in comparison to, what's just happening on Egghead. And it's a great, it does great things with the panel composition. Like, even though we don't see what this thing is, it tells us so much just with its relative size on the panel. Now, I do also like this little panel of Luffy sort of going from being full of food back to his normal size, just because it has this cool little, round composition that, is disappearing. It's his big belly that's disappearing, but it just gives the image a sort of clarity to it. It draws focus here to the center. Luffy stands out really clearly compared to everything around him because we have that shape sort of defining things at the center. Now, I think there's also some good eye direction because as the eye is going across here, it then shoots down, and I think feels like it's hitting as, it's sort of causing the explosion like a cannonball as it sort of travels down here. Now, for the last couple videos, I was talking a lot about this motif of the ships kind of approaching the island and how this is sort of the key visual that we use to tell us, this is the situation we're in. And we're still using that. I'm not sure if this usage of it really stands out in any particular way, but it's, reminding us that this is what's happening, because when you see a motif like this, it calls back to your brain the prior times you've seen it, and sort of when you get back to reading a chapter, it's been a week since you've read the chapter before, it makes you think, oh yeah, this is what's happening, which, for those of us who are hardcore One Piece fans, doesn't really matter that much, because we've spent all week thinking about what's happening on Egghead, but for every reader, it just helps bridge the gap of the sort of break between reading chapters. And yeah, Nuf, which is, I guess, how I'm going to pronounce your name in chat. Yeah, the way the eye sort of goes down with Luffy's legs and then goes up with this leg and the weapons up here is pretty nice too. Now, some good right-to-left momentum as we sort of go from these soldiers shooting. And one thing I like about this page is that, more so in the page layout than the actual physical layout in World, all of the aggression is being pointed towards Kuma and everyone falling from the sky. All these guns are pointing toward them on the page, and the pacifistas are shooting up at them. Which also sort of fits how the height of the people falling is sort of highly emphasized here. Something we were getting last chapter is that people were always looking up at them because the story, their physical position matters. The story isn't just saying, having them generically in danger. They're in danger because they're up high in the air, and so we're using height in framing a lot. We're having characters looking and pointing up. Now I think that's it for this page other than, good panel ellipsis use. So let's move on to the next page. One thing that I think is pretty cool here is the use of these leitmotifs. This is actually something that showed up last chapter, but I sort of cut from the video for time. But what I really like is that Oda has been so consistent about using these exact kind of flashes of lights to show lasers, which really only come from 3 characters, Frankie, Pacifistas, or Kizaru, that we understand sort of what's happening. This page is clear due to this motif, even though we don't even see the characters. Like, if you jumped into this page with no context of One Piece, you would not know what these flashes of light are, but he's set up the motif so well that we just instinctively see this and we think, okay, this is where the Pacifistas are aiming up. Which is one of those things where, like, you don't need to draw the characters themselves because the imagery is so clear, and it's not just that it's the same image each time, it's not just that it's the same motif, it's that it's a very shaped motif, which makes it easy to recognize and remember. It's this cross shape and a bunch of circles around them. That is what makes this so easy to remember. I mean, it literally, when I draw it out like this, looks like a sort of crosshair target, like you're playing a sniper in a video game. I think that fits it really well. Now, there's good eye direction as you go across here, because the eye is going across all the characters, who are laid out perfectly such that they look sort of chaotic and out of sorts and upside down, but you can still make out each one of them clearly with their shapes and everything. And of course, then the eye can also go down this way as it goes down to the next panel, There's some very clear shape, it's sort of triangular, more like a tent almost. Now, I think this sequence works really well for how textless it is. It's a great way to kind of build tension. I talked a lot in the video on chapter 1105, which hopefully will get back up on YouTube soon, about that feeling of hanging in the air, of, hanging in the air and being like, how do I put this? Frozen in time. And I think that these sort of textless panels help enhance that feeling. They extend that frozen moment because we don't have text. We also don't feel like time is progressing in this moment, which sort of makes it feel like, with these tight panels, not too much time is passing from here to here. This is still within that same instant. Now, also, the eye direction is pretty great here, as we still went across here the first time, and then the eye sort of goes across with these characters, down with, that's Atlas, right? I can never keep track of the names of Vegapunk's bodies, but it goes down with Atlas's view, along Bonnie's eyes, and then goes along up Bonnie's visions with the Pacifista's arms, and those arms are pointing us right up towards the next page. The eye direction, one thing I don't always get a chance to talk about in my videos is the eye direction going from one page to the next. You'll often see panels like this one that are specifically trying to point you up towards the next page. Now, more good eye direction here. I like, again, the sense of height that we get. The fact that, these characters are falling from the sky, and that doesn't just mean they're sort of generically in danger. We're going to emphasize the height in those physical positions through the composition. So we have them super high up in this panel as the eye can sort of go across here and then go down with this Kuma's arm. And honestly, this is just one of those good-looking panels, it just has a good shape to it, it's a good page. We have a strong sense of a foreground-background contrast, which, this is getting a little messy, but foreground, background, you get that sense of depth between them that I think looks really good. Now, one little detail I like is how the sound effects here are sort of helping pull the eye down from the page, the panel above, that is. Like, this is one of those cases where you don't really need to see this panel before this panel. It doesn't affect much if your eye is going across this one before it reaches Bonnie. And so this can, show up here to help draw the eye down to then Bonnie, but, again, there's nothing being spoiled by the eye crossing over the next panel first. Now, I think that it's really cool how this panel is showing the marine perspective on the Pacifistas, because think about how this story is being composed. Bonnie is issuing a command to the pacifistas, and we're about to find out that the pacifistas actually obey her commands. And when we find that out, the perspective it makes sense to frame that through is the Marines, because the Marines are the ones who are about to be really going through it. The Marines are the ones who are about to go through a change in perception. They're about to realize these things that they thought were their allies are actually now their enemies. And I think that this chapter would be a lot weaker if it didn't, take some panels to show the Marine perspective, because again, it's from the Marine perspective that the change really has impact. Now, I mentioned this a lot, but Oda is so consistent about using these flashes of light to draw the eye. Like, this is drawing us down, then it's drawing us up towards here, and then this pacifista's eyes are drawing us toward the Marines. This is always happening. These lines are always being used to direct the eye. Now, I really like this initial turn from the pacifista, because it's essentially pointing towards us, the readers, and then twisting around and pointing towards the Marines. And I think that this sort of close-up shot where we see the change in angle is really effective. It really hammers home, in like a very raw visual sense, just the base concept of this thing is pointing somewhere and then it changes to pointing somewhere else. And you can say the idea of something changing where it's pointing is absurdly simple, but I think building your paneling off of making those very simple physical motions really clear is what makes things so fun to read. And now, of course, we do go back to the pacifistas pointing down with this sort of change in perspective that now they're facing down not towards us, but toward the Marines. But I think it ultimately works because, these are just subtle background things. It isn't trying to remain super consistent about whether pointing down is pointing at the good guys or at the Marines. Now, once again, we're having that motif of all the ships approaching the island pay off. And I don't have the example on hand, but when the Marines were even just first arriving at the island, the story was making sure to frame it so we saw the pacifistas were on the coast. They were standing in these exact positions. They were just pointing in the opposite direction. And so we're really taking these motifs, these visuals, and these physical positions that have been set up for the last couple dozen chapters, or even earlier than that, since before Kuma's backstory, and recontextualizing. We're getting a visual payoff to the visuals we set up before. Now, I really like how this page is drawn, just because of how bendy it makes the ships. Like, look at all the ship's masts, and look at how they're bending in the wrong positions. Masts are generally supposed to remain parallel to each other, but here they're literally breaking off. And I think that disorder in the lines not being parallel is a great way to sort of represent the chaos and destruction that's being pushed on the Marines here. That it's taking their kind of intended to be orderly, formation, their ships, and breaking them. Like, sure, we don't need to see those masts bending in the wrong directions to understand that the ships are broken, but that imagery does just make it hit a little harder, that we have, we don't just have these explosions breaking things, but literally have the structure of the ships themselves being warped. Now, I think this page also just has a good rhythm to it in how it reads, because look at what you sort of see as you go across. Big circle composition for destruction, little circle for pacifistas. Another big circle for destruction, little circle for pacifistas, and then another big circle for destruction. And this, for one thing, just makes it a little more engaging to read. It makes it so there's some variety. It doesn't, things aren't clumped together in an uncomfortable way. It would look a lot worse if sort of we had all these big circle compositions on the left and the little circle compositions on the right. It's just more interesting to read this way. And it also helps emphasize that, the pacifistas are incredibly powerful weapons. They are causing destruction much larger than they are, which, many characters in One Piece do, of course, but, is shown well here, and it's worth showing whenever it happens. It's worth having the visuals sort of represent that properly. Now, I think that's all I have to say about this panel, but honestly, besides everything I'm saying about it, just a good-looking panel, just, well-drawn destruction. Now, this is the one that I thought was sort of interesting, and I wasn't entirely sure exactly why, although I'm starting to have a thought of what I think is cool about it, but we'll get to that. But for starters, I really like the sort of wall of pacifistas here. Just the way, it's a cool visual that makes them feel very defensive. The fact that they are so orderly while there's so much chaos with the Marines is, I think, just a good visual representation of how this situation really feels for them right now. Now, let me see at my notes. Let me see, which page was I on? Now, as we go over to the second half of the page, again, we're sort of emphasizing this small circle to big circle composition, and we also have this sort of larger circle composition going on at the page as a whole. And this sort of overlapping circles of different sizes, just makes a composition easier to read and sort of pop out. Like, yeah, we are talking about recent Oda art, so, it's a little more cluttered, a little more messy than maybe the classic days, but so many artists might draw messy stuff that just doesn't have any composition unifying the images to give it a proper feeling, make it easy to read. And here, we absolutely are getting that. We're absolutely getting this sort of contrast in shapes that just makes the image sort of stick with you in a way that it doesn't if you don't have that composition going on. But I think what I really like about this page is actually the way we sort of get a swing around. Like, look at how the pacifistas are pointed here. They're pointing to the right. Then down in this panel, they're sort of pointing to the right but more diagonally down. And as we get to this panel, they're pointed to the left. And what it makes it feel like is we're sort of pivoting our directions. We're sort of going around in this order in the page as a whole. And I think that's really cool because it just conceptually fits how the pacifistas are attacking right now. It conceptually fits that they're sort of these small, centralized sort of entities of power that are radiating damage outwards, and they're sort of like turning, every direction they point, they're causing more destruction. Like, you can convey a strong defensive power by making it the larger shape, but instead here, it's done by making them the smaller shape, but showing that there's, no direction where they're being caught from behind. And this is all, of course, in the sort of conceptual, compositional sense. Obviously they could literally be caught from behind, although I think they're resilient enough that it probably wouldn't work very well. But yeah, you get what I mean? That, like, I don't know, sometimes there's just a very raw, very fundamental sort of physical movement to what we're showing that I think just fits the concept of what's happening physically, and that's what I think is happening here. Now, the last thing that's really cool about this page is how it's being framed through Vegapunk. We're sort of repeatedly, we're not just getting Vegapunk's thoughts sort of superimposed over the whole thing, we're also getting Vegapunk in these tight shots that are focused on the fact that he is thinking things. And what this is doing is pulling us into Vegapunk's mind. It's making us sort of focus on what he's thinking about, but not on what's around him, which means we do have Vegapunk on our mind, so when something happens to Vegapunk on the next page, it's not going to catch us off guard. We're not going to be thinking, wait, where was Vegapunk? I'm confused by how something could happen to Vegapunk. But it is making it so, much like Vegapunk, we are immediately getting shocked when something comes from behind him and stabs straight through him in a great diagonal down and to the left motion. Again, you sort of get that feeling because we had tight panels focusing on him, and now he was forced to have his perspective expand outward, not in the literal sense of where he's looking, but in what he's thinking about. He has to think about his immediate surroundings when he wasn't really thinking about them before. Although you could argue that it's maybe not exactly that because he knew that this would happen, but either way, it's sort of doing that to the reader. It's building this tension that you don't realize was there until there's suddenly a release of that tension. Now again, I've talked about this a few videos in a row now, but I love the way Saturn is always drawn diagonally. It always makes it feel like he's looking down on people, but also, his glare here is actually looking down in the other direction at Bonnie because, how pissed he is about that. Now, let's see. Once again, we sort of end the page with a motion that's deliberately pointing us upwards towards the next page, which is something that Oda does a lot, and a lot of the times I don't get a chance to refer to just because of how I split up the structure of my videos. Now, as we get here, you know, one thing that Oda loves to do with Kizaru is have these mixes of circular and radial compositions. The circle sort of tells us where it's all coming from and emphasizes some power there, but the radial composition just perfectly matches what the attack is, that it's going through people out in these askew directions. Now, not a ton else I have to say about how this page is done. I mean, there's some good close-ups to sort of, you know, again, as always, show that how characters feel in the middle of a One Piece fight is as important as what they do. Sort of pulls us into that moment. This isn't just, you know, Kizaru used this move, someone else used another move in response. It's, this had this effect on the characters. And I like the setup we get for the sort of swing here. We see how he's holding his blade back, so we're expecting his blade to swing around like this. That's the motion that we're anticipating going into the next page. And because we're anticipating that moment, we can then counter that moment, which was supposed to go around this way, but then we count, it's, you know, right to left, we counter it with a strong left to right. Which Sanji panel do you mean? Top Hat Geo, you're saying that Sanji panel didn't read super clearly to you. Not sure which panel you mean, Top Hat Geo. Before the Kizaru slice. I'm not seeing a Sanji panel on this page, do you mean, is the thing. Maybe I'm even more confused than you are and I'm missing, you know, maybe there's a really confusing panel problem here. Oh, honestly, you're right, this is kind of unclear, but it's also one of those things that doesn't affect much. Like, I agree this is unclear, and I think the problem is that Sanji's face in that part of the composition is just too scribbly and doesn't have a strong shape to it. Like, Frankie's face is kind of scribbly, but it's more in focus, and it has a strong shape that makes it just recognize from the chin that it's Frankie. But Sanji, you know, this stuff here in the middle, but it doesn't affect too much because this isn't failing to convey, like, a clear action. It isn't failing to convey how Sanji moves, which would be a much bigger issue. It's really more for the pacing than anything else. Like, it doesn't matter that much that we're seeing Sanji's reaction. It's just, like, Sanji being Sanji here is not super important. It's important that he came up to try and save them, and he'll probably do important things after, but it's more about the pacing of having a kind of reaction to the attack before we go into the next attack. But I do agree, obviously, it would be better if it was clearer. That much is indisputable. But yeah, as we come into this next page, you know, as the eye goes across, we have Kizaru's eyes pointing in the right direction. We're getting, because, you know, Kizaru was attacking from the right to left, and as Oda does so often, if you want to show a character being caught off guard or outsped or anything, then you have something appear in the opposite direction from where they were facing. And so we have Kizaru's eyes pointing behind him to Luffy on his right. And as the eye goes across here, then it can zoom down with Luffy's fist. And I love how this panel looks. Just, you know, the rush of speed as the fist comes in, you know, the way it sort of takes up half the page while the other half isn't Kizaru so much as it's the distance that Kizaru is sent flying. So good. You know, the contrast between the dark shades here, the thick lines that imply a sense of power, versus not much power going on over here. It just looks great. And of course, you know, this great spiky, round composition to emphasize the power of the attack. Now, some more good eye direction is going on as we go through here. You know, the eye goes down with this, with Luffy's swinging arm, then it goes up with Bonnie, down with Luffy's leg, and then up with his next leg. And I think we have some great visuals that sort of convey just how Luffy's powers are going, how all of that's working, just with how bendy all of this is, and how all these straight buildings, you know, these straight lines of the skyscrapers, which last chapter we saw collapsing, but still in a straight way, to show the destruction of Vegapunk everything cared about. This time they're bending, which is more surreal imagery and tells us that this isn't destruction, it's just a weird power. And of course, we need to establish that this is becoming bouncy, so we can see that these characters who have been falling for like half of last chapter and half of this chapter land safely. And that's something that I think, you know, subtly stands out about One Piece, that the fighting, or not even just the fighting, like this isn't really okay, Luffy got a brief action moment, but it's not like these characters were involved in a fight scene so much as it was just the plot that they were flying through the air and had to land. But that plot is so physical. And because it's so physical, you know, we don't just cut away and then the next time we see them, they're on the ground and okay. If they were in the air, we need to show how they land, because One Piece is a physical and a visual story. And that means that that has to be resolved. And of course, as the eye is coming down from this panel, it's going down in the motion that they're falling in, because Oda just always finds ways to align motion like that cleverly. Now, let me see. Was there anything else I wanted to talk about in this one? Oh yeah, one thing I thought was interesting was the contrast between Luffy's pose and Kizaru's pose. Like, look at these two panels. Look at this. Luffy, legs outstretched. Kizaru, legs pointing inward. And doesn't that represent the difference in their attitudes? Luffy is, you know, excited, happy, outgoing, while Kizaru is being introspective here. He's worried. You know, I think that it's cool to frame this panel, or this page, just with that level of contrast. You know, you don't notice it, but it, you know, subconsciously, it does influence your impression of how these characters are feeling at the moment. Now, as the eye sort of is, you know, directed cleanly along what's important here, I like the sort of focus we get on Bonnie looking downward, you know? We're looking downward with her, and then as we sort of get further in the page, we twist to looking up. We switch to looking up, and then as her eye comes up to the big panel, it's literally looking up with her. It's following her up there, giving us the same feeling of looking up in wonder as we suddenly see that Luffy's here. There's some excellent composition here, you know, with the sound effects being used to frame the arc with which Luffy is flying. You know, the buildings all framing this. It's just a great looking composition that makes Luffy really stand out with his brightness, you know, how he's suddenly controlling the situation but having fun, and the effect that it's having on Bonnie. And there's something, this isn't really a paneling point, but there's something I really like about the story composition here that I think might sound simple, but as someone who has actually tried to work on writing stories is, I think, actually trickier than you might think. And that's just the fact that it, you know, I don't know if Vegapunk will die here, but the story was perfectly composed such that Vegapunk could give his speech, you know, could have this dying moment where he sort of is trying to communicate to Bonnie where she should look, where he's still a little bit aware here. And that's because, you know, Vegapunk being punished by Saturn was perfectly interwoven with the part of the story where Luffy is also showing up as Nika. And the story didn't have to do that. Like, Luffy returning as Nika for Bonnie to see him, and Bonnie getting the information that she can control the Pacifistas, which causes Saturn to punish Vegapunk, those were not inherently going to happen at the same point in the story. That was actually, you know, a deliberate choice by Oda. But what that deliberate, you know, what I'm saying is, in the drafting phase of the story, when he's planning out the chapter or the arc as a whole and where he wants things to take place, he had to deliberately make it happen that these things would align so that we could have this moment, so we could have the dramatic framing of just as Vegapunk, you know, sort of gives his speech on his wishes for Bonnie and then sort of starts to fall apart. That's when Bonnie then gets to find some hope again as she sees Nika. You know, that kind of thing. It doesn't always happen by accident. How you put a story together is a deliberate thing. Now, finally, we get to the reveal of the pirates here, and again, we're having all of this huge framing you know, the ship is towering over the Marines, and in this panel, it's like the Marines are sort of looking up at it and how huge it is. Again, you know, the ship is just towering over them. We're really emphasizing that size because that size is important here. And one thing I like with that is how small and tiny the cannonballs feel. You know, cannonballs are inherently a small thing, but framing a small thing that is relative to a ship, but you can frame cannonballs as large if you want to make them feel like a threat. Here, they're framed as something petty and meaningless just in how they're drawn. You know, they just do not have any sense of power here because they're not going to do anything against the giant pirates. Now, when you're reading this page, you're probably going to see the giant pirates here. You're probably not going to, like, will yourself to not see this big panel as you sort of go along here and only realize that the giant pirates are here after you've read the sequence. Like, no. You're gonna see the giant pirates are here. So the point of these two panels is not to, like, hint at the fact that that these are Dory and Broggy before you see them. You know, it's less about, you know, literally the order in which you get information, and more about just the sense of build-up and framing. Like, even if you see that Dory and Broggy are here first, when you know, go through the panel and read it, you're still going to get a sense of just, you know, how epic it is that they're here from these small panels. And it's, you know, as usual, an example of how you don't just want to have these full-page spreads that show everything, you want to have small panels that build them up. Because, you know, even if you see the full-page spread first, small panels just enhance that feeling. We're contrasting how huge they are with how small, with, you know, the small hints at first. Now, I really like the composition of this panel, the big one, just for the sort of curve that you go through. You know, it has this great shape to it, you know, it's, you know, the beard aligning it with it, the sword aligning with it, the curve on the right side aligning with Broggy's beard. It just does a great job of just giving an interesting shape to look at for it. And they have this shape while they're completely destroying the shape of the Marine ships. You know, it's very, how do I put this? You know, they are dominating this page. This panel does a lot to make it feel like the ships are not shit compared to them. And one of the things that it does that with is the coloring. Like, look at how these two are shaded with black and white. You know, black and white, they draw the eye more, they have more contrast, they're more extreme than gray, while the Marine ships are totally gray here. And that's because the Marine ships are basically irrelevant to the pirates. The pirates are zooming straight through them. You are not looking at the Marine ships and thinking about how impressive they are. Your eyes are being drawn to the huge figures with a ton of contrast in how they're drawn. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the paneling of this chapter. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope, you know, and I think I'm going to call the stream here because probably should have announced the stream earlier than I did so people would know to be ready for it today. But, yeah, so gonna call it here. Not gonna continue with any gaming today. I do have some other things I should probably get to today. But, as soon as I'm done, I'm going to, you know, try and get the VOD up on my second YouTube channel. So, if you missed the early parts of this, like, if you're listening right now and you're thinking, oh no, I missed this, don't worry, like, it'll take a few minutes, but, like, check my Twitter in 15 minutes or half an hour, and there will be a link to the VOD of this whole thing so you can watch it from the start. So, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll, you know, well, I hope to get my channel back, so I'd rather not see you guys next week on a stream, but if it has to be a stream, then it'll be a stream. But yeah, thanks for watching.